If you enjoy this podcast, look out for my new book, Mondo Documentary. It compiles short essays on hundreds of documentary films. Judd Apatow says it's required reading for anyone who loves nonfiction cinema. You won't find it on Amazon, but you can order it anywhere in the world at purenonfiction.net. The Netflix series Sean Combs: The Reckoning tells an inside story of the disgraced hip-hop mogul. I speak with the director, Alex Stapleton. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. The four-part series, Sean Combs: The Reckoning, was released on December 2nd and quickly became a Netflix hit with millions of viewers. You can go down a deep rabbit hole of reactions to the series. The project was first inspired in November 2023 when the recording artist Cassie Ventura filed a lawsuit against Combs, accusing him of rape, sexual assault, physical abuse, and sex trafficking. Combs settled the next day for $20 million. But the case opened a flood of inquiries. Almost a year later, Combs was arrested by federal officers. He went to trial this year and was convicted on 2 counts of transporting individuals for prostitution. There are over 70 other civil cases brought against him that are still making their way through the legal system. He's broadly denied the charges against him. In Sean Combs: The Reckoning, each episode is loaded with new testimonies and perspectives. There are more angles than I can easily summarize, but let me acknowledge 2 notable things about the series. The first is its executive producer, Curtis Jackson, the hip-hop artist, actor, and entrepreneur known as 50 Cent. Over the past 20 years, he's had multiple public feuds with Combs. You'll hear more about that later. The second thing to mention is that the series contains candid footage from September 2024 in the week leading up to Combs' arrest. We watch him interact with his inner circle, seeking to manipulate the media and the justice system like he has multiple times before. Combs had hired a film team to capture this footage for his own purposes, but somehow it got shared with the 50 Cent production. Last week, I connected by Zoom to the series director, Alex Stapleton. Over the past 15 years, she's directed documentary profiles on a wide range of personalities, including Roger Corman, Chelsea Handler, and Reggie Jackson. In recent weeks, she's been repeatedly asked how her team got the insider footage of Combs, and she's repeatedly answered that the source is confidential. But I was focused on other questions. To begin, I asked her what the world of Sean Combs and his music label Bad Boy had meant to her before this project.
Well, I was a teenager in the 90s, so I was probably like the key demo growing up in Houston. And so that was my, I grew up with hip hop, but like Bad Boy was definitely like New York, the sound of New York, Biggie Smalls. One of my earliest hip hop memories was getting a tape. I had the Who's the Man soundtrack, and it actually had Biggie's Party and Bullshit single on the cassette tape, and I played it until like it broke. So I was a fan of Biggie Smalls, of a lot of the stuff that Sean put out back in the day.
I mean, Sean Combs liked to hold himself up as an example of Black success, and I wonder if that was something that you felt.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's always incredible to aspire to like make something of your life and to have a career, and to see these really significant role models and like Sean Combs, who were able to kind of, in Texas, we say out the mud, you come out the mud, to kind of make nothing into something. And so, I definitely 1,000% was inspired by him, at points of my life. And then obviously I moved to New York when I turned 18. And so Rockefeller Records, Bad Boy Records, in the 2000s, like he reinvented himself in a new arena, beyond just music, but with fashion and reality TV. And that was kind of like my second exposure to Sean Combs. But this time I was sort of, in his playground in New York City.
Did there come a time when you started to see cracks in this facade or see a dark side to his world?
I mean, I think just from my own lived experience, in my 20s, I think the culture in general wasn't necessarily things that were tied down to Sean Combs, but, being a young woman during that time period, pre-Me Too, before cell phones were, rampant, and before social media, you knew as a young woman, like, these are places that I don't go to alone. These are things that I do. This is when it's getting a little bit too out of control. I had a lot of other friends that worked in the industry, in the music industry, and for other labels, and there were things that you knew about, but you just kind of like, I think that there was just, that's the way it is, For me, I guess I was somewhat lucky that I wasn't really wrapped up into the music industry. I mean, I was in a whole nother turbulent era of like the film industry, the independent scene. And that world also was, there were predators in that world as well. So, it was a very interesting place to be a young woman in New York back in the day, back during that time period.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of horrible parallels.
Yes.
So describe to me how you were brought into this project.
Well, for me, I started working on it the day, or my curiosity was definitely piqued the day that Cassie dropped her lawsuit. I think that, maybe like some of the stories that I remember from way back in my brain, 20 years later, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is a really, these are very serious and, allegations that I had never heard of in that much detail in what she put out there. And then I guess that there was a settlement, and then the next day it was like poof. I was trying to link up with her team actually, and with her, and then it kind of like disappeared. And it was very strange because that news cycle was like wild, and then it was like nothing. And so I guess I was, pretty determined to figure out, like, I want to know more about what was going on. She named a lot of other people. There was just, it seemed like this whole ecosystem that she was a part of. And that to me was very interesting. At the same time, I was already working with 50 and the guys at G Unit on other projects. And, 50 was very public about wanting to put together a documentary. So we had a conversation because I was like, I'm really interested in this. You are definitely very interested in this. And so we had a really long, very serious conversation about that if we were going to partner and come together to put this thing together, that we were committed to letting the truth, to finding as much truth as we could. We were committed to getting into like the uncomfortable areas of conversation where sometimes, there's blurred lines of like who's a victim and who's a perpetrator, and the nuances of this world, and some of the things that I think we both knew it was going to unearth. And then, we were off to the races from then.
So 50 Cent is the executive producer on this project. It's a complicated person to have as an executive producer. On the one hand, he brings obvious strengths. He knows the hip hop world inside out in a way that other investigative journalists will just never get to. On the other hand, he's got a history of public beefs with Sean Combs. He's been criticized a lot for misogyny of himself and for mocking victims of assault. And, I don't think it's your job to answer for him, but, I am interested to understand how you navigated, him as a very big presence in this project.
Well, as someone who studied under some of the greats in the doc world back in the 2000s. I would definitely say this whole experience has been a departure from what I think is like the norm. But the whole story is complex and not quote unquote normal. Or on one level, I think that the hip hop community and that space is really different than other worlds in on many different levels. And I knew that when I started this, this is also, we have to just remember, this is before anyone knew that there were going to be federal charges, brought against Sean. He was not indicted. No one had any idea of how this was all going to play out and that there was going to be this giant trial, to take place later. I knew that I needed someone from the hip hop space and the community that was a very formidable presence to bring, to get people to kind of feel safe to talk. Because I think that, in all of this conversation, people forget that a part of what the ecosystem that he designed was, a culture of siloing out people, silencing people, keeping like these plates spinning so that no one really, there was no comfort in numbers, going against him or speaking out against him. And there was a real culture of fear. And the fear was palpable. I mean, the fear was really serious because for some people it was like, I may never work again. And that's a problem because I have a family and I'm the breadwinner and I have to take care of my children and put food on the table. For others, the fear was life-threatening. They really felt that if they said something, their life was on the line. So in working with someone like 50, there's just, he really was the biggest voice in hip hop that was speaking out publicly, very publicly, and was not afraid of doing that against Sean and against some of the practices that were going on. That was, sort of kind of a part of what our partnership, what got me in to conversations with people that eventually partook in the series, or conversations with people that, I've had a ton of conversations, off the record, or people that I never sat down and I never filmed with, but that really opened up a lot of doors. And I don't know, for anyone who wants to critique that, I don't know where else or how else that was going to happen. I think that 50, to answer, a lot of the other things that you brought up, that is, those are questions for 50. But there were no allegations at this level. There was nothing proven. It wasn't like I was working with someone. It's like that had the baggage that Sean obviously had. The social media presence of 50 is the social media presence of 50. All I can say is that, in doing this film and making this project, this was, I was the director. I'm also an executive producer of it. It was my team putting it together. And there wasn't, 50 wasn't looking over my shoulder or pushing the keyboard to tell me, put this in or don't put this, or don't put this in. And I think he's also been very public about that. But he definitely provided, he opened doors, and he provided also, a shield, because obviously in making content like this, it's scary, and there were threats, there were threats to people that I was working with, there were certain days where, we were all on edge. Like, are we going to all get home okay? And so there's a lot of that's baked into this story that people don't always understand. And I think as a documentarian, I was committed to telling the best story that I could, and this was the world that we created to try to provide safety for people to come forward and to talk.
Each one of these episodes is packed with information. There's sometimes where there's an episodic documentary series and you feel like, this could have been, 90 minutes and they padded it out. That is not what's happening in your series. Like, each one almost stands alone as its own film. So I do want to just kind of go through the 4 episodes and ask you, a question about each one. Let me start with episode 1. Two of the key figures that you interview there are people who come back in the series. They're people who've known Combs for decades, Tim Patterson and Kirk Burroughs. Tim Patterson grew up with Sean Combs and was professionally involved. Kirk Burroughs was a partner in Bad Boy. They speak with a great deal of candor, a lot of regrets they're expressing in hindsight. Can you describe what it took to get them to open up and participate in this?
Both of them, it took a long time to get to them. I knew from all of the research that I had conducted, all the conversations that I were having, that these were kind of two holy grail interviews that were really key to making a lot of things make sense. When I, sat down and even wrote like a treatment about how I kind of was envisioning the 4 episodes to go, I knew that it was really important to dig into the origin story. For me, like as a documentarian, to get into to this story and to even examine some of the allegations of sexual assault and sexual violence and just violence, period. I really believe that context is key. And also going back to that idea of, as Tim Dog says, monsters are not born, monsters are made. And I really thought that that unearthing that was very, 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 very key and critical to making the rest of the story make sense. So they were very important guys to sit down with. I only wish that I could have. There's more people, from his early days, his childhood, his school days at Catholic school, and even the early Uptown era. There were more people that I wanted to get to sit down for interviews. I spoke with quite a number of other guys, but these were the two that were fearless enough to let me turn on the camera and to share their story with the public.
Another important figure in episode 1 is Joy Dickerson Neal. She tells a story from 1991 alleging that Combs drugged and raped her and made a video of the assaults that he was showing to his friends. She has an open lawsuit over this that's still pending. And from what I understand, this was not a story she had gone public with until Cassie Ventura's lawsuit, and that kind of gave her the courage to finally speak up about this thing that happened several decades ago. So what did it mean to interview Joy Dickerson Neal?
Also, a very a woman that I'm very grateful, that she sat down and opened up. It was really interesting though, because we, as it's in the film, we don't really go into the horrible details that about her allegations and what happened to her, and that was really important. That was a unique experience as a filmmaker, to not really talk about the event so much as to talk about what led up to it, her mindset, what his reputation was like at the time period. I also wanted to talk about the fact that she says that it was taped, and there was another artist at the time who actually informed her that hey, there's this videotape going around, and this is like the early 90s. This is way before, this is decades before what we would then read, Cassie, described with filming, sexual acts. And so again, and trying to create a series where we could learn a bit more about the origin story, we could learn and perhaps ask questions about patterns of behavior versus, all of this just started in the year 2008. I thought it was really important to like go way back in time and to understand, if this is all true, then what, then we have to look deeper to understand, well, Sean is very young. And so what would have been the influences for him to think that this type of behavior was acceptable on any level? And it also kind of shows you, which is like a theme of the series, and going back to your earlier question about my partnership with 50, it's like, this is a story where the world that we're in, it's, street culture is a part of it. And the music industry, hip hop was such a young, such a, it was like a new a whole new genre that was just being created at that time period. And guys, that were popular on the streets for, drug dealing or just, doing whatever type of activities they had going on, they were looked up to, and a lot of them are actually funding artists, or, labels, and we're putting money in a way for them to even, legitimize their businesses. And that's not new to the record industry. I just want to make that clear. The record industry has been seeded with the mob at one point, at different times. But I just was trying to show this triangulation of who were the guys, who were some of the people in the streets that people looked up to. And so it was really fascinating when Kirk, was like, well, let's talk about the rooftop, and let's talk about Alpo, and let's talk about, what he would do and how that could have influenced, a young Sean Combs to try to emulate that type of behavior, and that was a part of Joy's allegation in her story.
There does feel like a giant what if question there. What if there had been a support system for Joy Dickerson Neal to, seek justice back in 1991? What difference could that have made in all the people who were devastated by Sean Combs in the decades after?
Yeah, it's a big question, right? I also thought with her story, the aftermath that she went through, that, it was really painful to hear her say that when she would tell people, they didn't want to get involved. They wanted to, it was like the beginning of like, let's just sweep it underneath the rug, right? Let's not talk about it. I think that's, look, that runs rampant in these types of stories about sexual assaults and what survivors have to go through. People don't want to get involved. And I think that's a bigger question for our society at large. It's not just relegated to the hip hop community, but, she was so young at that time, and, she's ambitious and wants to make something of her life. And she's working, sort of in the same industry. And, there's embarrassment, there's, I'm trying to tell people about it, but no one wants to listen to me. And when she said no one wanted to help her because they wanted to keep getting invited to his parties, I was just floored by that comment, because again, cutting to Cassie's lawsuit, cutting to like the mid to late 2000s, all the way up, to the teens, with Sean, who is infamous for these parties, these white parties. Again, it was just very interesting to see where our morality lies as a society. And that was really important, to get across with this series, was this is not just a story about Sean Combs. This should be a mirror that we hold up to ourselves as a society. Where do we hold ourselves accountable, when it comes to learning about this type of behavior, and how we collectively sweep it underneath the rug?
Yeah. So let me ask about episode 2. The meat of that episode is digging into the murders of Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls in 1996, 97. In the hip hop world, these are like JFK's assassination and all the like mysteries and conspiracies that still swirl so many decades later. You're interviewing people with distinct points of view that are going to foster more debates. And I have to say, when I got to episode 2, I was expecting more insights into the recent events that put Combs on trial, and those do come in episodes 3 and 4. But I'm interested to know what you felt was important about going back to this history around Tupac and Biggie's deaths.
Well, if the story for episodes 1 through 4 are really, it's Sean, a little bit of a dive through the lens of Tim Dog into his childhood, putting forward as much as I could about that subject matter. But it's really it's about Sean, but then kind of like expanding from that, it's the world that he built, which was Bad Boy. And so the series is really telling you the story of Sean Combs through, Bad Boy. And so we get a little bit into Uptown because you need to understand what he was doing at Uptown and how Bad Boy was created out of that, what he learned, from Andre Harrell, the relationship of him with Kirk Burroughs, that started at Uptown and then, went into the world of Bad Boy. So if you're telling the story of Bad Boy, you have to talk about the 90s. And this was a big part of the Bad Boy legacy, was their involvement with this, quote unquote, East Coast, West Coast, war, beef, whatever you want to call it. And so the goal, when I approach films, I'm not trying to I'm not going to talk about this because everyone's, this subject matter has been, discussed ad nauseum. That's not the point of the film. The point of the film is like, I am striving to bring new voices to this conversation. And that is what the film did. Kirk Burroughs was not a household name. Most people didn't even understand that Kirk Burroughs that there was somebody else who co-founded Bad Boy with Sean Combs. And so when you tell the story of him and how he got, his tenure there, what he did to establish that label, and then why he got fired, that's also, twined with the story of the East Coast, West Coast rivalry. And, I think through his storytelling, you start to learn that some of these characters in this very, this tragedy, it's been designed and told in a very specific way, which was so much of the attention of that was like Tupac Shakur versus Biggie Smalls. And what I kind of wanted to recenter the conversation in was, okay, Suge Knight and Sean Combs. And Suge Knight is someone who comes from Uptown. Suge Knight is on the East Coast, even though he's, from California, he's working, he knows Andre, he knows Sean is an intern. And then he kind of takes all of this knowledge that he got from the music industry and as a bodyguard, and then goes to the West Coast and creates a label that's a little bit of a counter, to what Andre Harrell and Uptown were doing and Bad Boy was doing. And I just thought that like all these little details get overlooked when we talk about this, and the motivations that people have, the motivations that they have to, I think for Sean, like the way he felt about Tupac, his from so many different accounts, that he was very jealous of Tupac and this relationship that he had with Biggie of wanting to be his friend, but he's also his boss, he's the label owner, but he also wants to be an artist. And like, I think this kind of very immature, kind of motivation that he had to like be to inject himself into the center of everything. And so I think that all of these pieces of like getting to understand Sean in a deeper level versus just focusing on the same, events like the Source Awards and then the horrible murders that took place. Again, you got to give context to all of this. You have to understand when you're watching the Source Awards, when Sean is trying to publicly show, hey, I'm just here, one love, I'm just here to bring everyone together. Well, were you, because we have all this testimony and we're able to see like behind closed doors, there was a lot of other things going on. Did he feel slighted from Suge because he actually wanted to be his friend too? And all of that is fascinating to me, and I think should be a part of the story. If anything, to understand how reckless it was that these guys, were unalived, and how that they were, that it's such a deep tragedy, and it wasn't just like young dudes in the street just trying to like, with all this bravado. There was a lot of other things that were going on. And so, so that was the reason for going there.
So in episode 3, you do focus on the harrowing details of Combs's sexual bullying and coercion, and And many people have described these events that Combs would have called freak-offs, where he'd hire sex workers, men and women, for these sexual marathons fueled by drugs. And and you interview one of the sex workers who had participated in this for years, former sex worker named Clayton Howard. And he brings a fascinating perspective because he really corroborates behavior that other victims have described. What do you think was his motivation to participate?
Well, I think that his motivation, the other thing to kind of like remember, even though this was not that long ago, is that when Cassie's lawsuit dropped, a lot of people who had kind of, I think, just buried their experiences with Cassie or with Cassie and Sean or with Sean, a lot of people had just moved on with their lives, and they were never going to come public about any of this. Cassie's lawsuit kind of was a Pandora's box, right? Where there's like a lot of things that were brought out. And for Clayton, I think, Clayton, a part of his story is that, the government found him and told him, like, hey, we want to question you about these things. It's been brought to our attention that, you were involved with these, with this part of what Cassie and Sean were doing. And that has to be sort of, I think if you put yourself in his shoes, that has to be a very shocking thing to deal with, when you're just, this is, 10 years prior, this was so long ago. So I think that, and then you're a part all of the sudden of like a giant trial, a trial by media, a federal investigation. And I think that for not just Clayton, but for other people that were a part of this show, like Capricorn Clark, wanting to sit down and talk was like, hey, I didn't see this coming, but now that I'm here, I want to give you my perspective and my POV. I think that Clayton felt, I think Clayton witnessed a lot of things that, like you said, corroborated a lot of what what Cassie testified to on the stand. I think Clayton was also very interesting, and if you pay attention to the film, you can also see that Clayton, I think, also felt, I think he also felt, slighted by Cassie as well. There's things that he talks about, in his interview, where Cassie introduces him to drugs and it's only natural that if you're doing this many sexual acts over almost 10 years, that you're going to form a relationship with both Cassie, and Sean. You're going to get to know them, or at least the people that they presented to you during that time period. And I think that he was sort of struggling and dealing with his feelings about all of it. He's a human being. And I think he was trying to make it make sense. And I think that's my judgment as to why he wanted to talk.
Well, I think there's so many figures in this who reveal their complications in the film, and I think it's a credit to the series that you make space for that. And so that brings me to episode 4, and Capricorn Clark, who you mentioned. She had worked on and off for Combs for 14 years. Even though she describes on her very first day of work, he was already threatening and intimidating her. But I think you get the sense of just what a powerful lure it was to work for him and be part of that world, that you would even put up with those kinds of threats and intimidations. And we see corollaries of that in people who worked for Harvey Weinstein or Scott Rudin. This is a phenomenon that we can see in many different parts of the entertainment world. But Capricorn Clark tells a story in 2011 when Combs was enraged with jealousy over Cassie being with a musician, Kid Cudi, and Clark says that Combs wanted to kill Kid Cudi, and in her words, kidnapped her, Clark, to be a part of this attack. And then after that wound up firing Clark because Combs didn't think that she was loyal enough. And there's a heartbreaking line that she says, that she says that she was prepared to keep this all to herself. In her words, she says, "I had more love for the culture than to embarrass him and take it all away from him like that. I wonder if you can, reflect on the how hard it is to wrap our minds around that as as viewers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a part of this conversation is giving, space, holding space, giving grace to victims of sexual violence, and how do we do that? I think that for Capricorn, it's sort of like, in talking about subjects like this, there's also the people that witness things, and I know that there's been a lot of chatter, in response to this series, and even, with some of the other things in the entertainment industry that you mentioned, like Harvey Weinstein, the people that saw things happen but didn't do anything. And I think it's really easy to just tell yourself, if like, hey, if I was there, I would have called the police, or I would have done this, or I would have, it's much easier said than done, right? Because these are people that the relationship that they had with Sean, who's sort of like, it's kind of like, to me, it reminds me a lot of like cult leaders and being in a cult. It's like, once you've been sort of conditioned to understand, like, this is what we do. This is a part of, like, of not just success about money, but this is how our culture is run. And if I do anything, I am putting myself, if I say anything, I am really putting myself in the line of fire. And I'm dealing with a person that, I may not have witnessed him do anything, physical to anyone, but I know he's got a whole bunch of guys around him, or I know that, people, I've heard the stories about what happens if you open up your mouth. And Capricorn had already, there's other things that she had gone through that we just didn't have the time in the series to talk about. Really horrible things that she, was dealing with. She was kidnapped on another instance, because he thought that she stole something. And so she was, held in question with like a lie detector. She was terrorized. And so when you see this type of behavior happen, and you've gone through years of being terrorized or witnessing, terror inflicted on your coworkers or other artists or other people, it's really hard to be the lone wolf, as a young woman, with no, she doesn't have parents, she doesn't really have a family. It's really difficult to just be like, I'm going to tell you off, and I'm going to take your story public. And I think that, again, what does that say about us as a society, that's where we place, like all the blame or the responsibility on, versus the people with power, that are actually inflicting this type of harm onto other people. Like, why are we shifting the blame and making, she's a victim in her own right, and so it's just, it's complicated, and it's very layered. And I hope that, like, what the series does is kind of, again, give context to all of these things so that we can have conversations about it, to hopefully prevent these types of things, just the repeated cycle of the type of behavior just over and over and over again.
I've only touched on a few of the, characters who are going to stay with me for a long time, and some of the moments that will stay with me for a long time. I could easily talk for hours and hours, but I do want to ask you about a different set of enablers in this situation. I think a real strength of your series is that you've got people from inside the world of hip hop, people who worked at many levels with Sean Combs. But there's a different part of his world dealing with corporate executives in the worlds of fashion and alcohol and entertainment. These are the people who helped make him a billionaire, and I assume saw him as someone who was going to give their brands an access to street culture, so-called, that was going to, bring them a market that they felt they couldn't get otherwise. And we're willing to turn a blind eye to a lot of things that we already knew about Sean Combs. There's a lot of things that we're talking about that we didn't know then, but there was I can remember being in New York City in 1999 for the Club New York shooting and feeling like, I can't believe this guy is ever going to work again. So, if there was to be a sequel to this, and these would be even harder interviews to get, I assume. But
Yes.
I wonder how you've reflected on that. That other class of white executives in the corporate world who were Sean Combs' enablers.
Well, that's an excellent question/point to bring up, and I think that again, the doc series never. I went as far as I could, with the time that I had. I think the immediate kind of hemorrhaging of to stop the hemorrhaging of just like the victim blaming of sexual assault survivors was something that was really important to discuss. But it's just one layer, it's just one part. And I think everything that you're discussing, I'm very well aware of, and believe me, I mean, there was a lot of work that went into trying to push into those layers of the corporate world and structures that I do believe that, when we're talking about sharing the responsibility of all of this, there's a lot of responsibility that lays on the shoulders of people that I'm sure had to have known that things were going on and, kept handing checks and money, over that allowed Sean to keep doing what he was doing. This is not the end all be all series about this subject matter. I hope that it only inspires other, filmmakers, even if it's not me, to keep investigating, keep pushing, and keep trying to unpack more that's there. I think that this is very much probably the beginning of a bigger story, even for him. I mean, he's got a million, not a million, literally. I have to be very
but over 70.
I say even dozens upon dozens, over 70 civil suits. As we're talking right now, we'll see what sticks and what might possibly go to trial. And I think that we're probably going to be exposed to the bigger ecosystem that housed Sean Combs, versus the ecosystem that he created that housed others. And I think that's a huge part of the story. And I think it's sort of like a huge part of just the problem, some of the chronic issues that we have in America right now, right? Like, in taking it into like a more macro conversation. And it's hard to do. It's hard to get those, you got to kind of rely on people to kind of become whistleblowers, to speak with you about what was going on. And so I just have to have faith that, as time goes on, potentially we can keep pushing back to figure out more about that. But I do think that it doesn't take away from the fact of the world that he did create with those resources and what he chose to do with them. But it doesn't negate that there were a lot of people giving him the resources. And so, I hope that all of this conversation, just gets picked up and again, just inspires, maybe like a younger filmmakers to get in there and to work towards, getting underneath the hood and exposing more.
I want to thank Alex Stapleton for speaking with me. Her 4-part series, Sean Combs: The Reckoning, is now playing on Netflix. If you want more film tips, look out for my new book, Mondo Documentary. Nelson George says it's like a giant wish list of films you can't wait to see. You can order it anywhere in the world, but not on Amazon, only from purenonfiction.net. Thanks to our team, Doc Voices writer Bella Racklin, series producer Hannah Nordenswan, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.